Hello there, guys. At the risk of sounding like every other YouTuber out there, I'd really appreciate it if you'd click the subscribe button. It's free, it doesn't cost you anything, and it allows my channel to grow, which means guests like the one you're about to watch, as well as more, would be willing to come on. Just give it a like, give it a subscribe, and we'll go from there. All right, thank you, and enjoy this episode.
Hi to all your viewers.
No, not a problem, not a problem. It's great to have you. So I know we've had a bit of back and forth. We met at the Battle of Ideas in person, which was really good. I'm interested in getting your take on the slavery conversation that seems to be in vogue at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a book about the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, which is the main anti-slavery society in Britain from like 1828 through to to the present day is currently called Anti-Slavery International. But I took my history up to 1950, I think, when they did change the name. And I was interested in it because I was writing empire history, and I'd done a book on previously on a thing called the Aborigines Protection Society, which was kind of native rights campaign, Victorian native rights campaign. So I was interested in the anti-slavery society as a movement in Britain, which I mean, you know, plainly it's a very emotionally loaded topic because human slavery is monstrous. And I don't think anybody can fail to emotionally put themselves in the position of an enslaved person. Hear these stories, I think it's compelling, and it's important to how we understand ourselves today. You know, freedom is like a fundamental value in Britain, and across the world it means something to people. So slavery is the like the moment. But I was looking at a very specific kind of a thing. So I ended up writing what was a history of a political movement in Britain, but takes in a lot of what slavery is and how we kind of understand ourselves in relationship to it. And it's become in a sense more rather than less important, in the sense that we think probably more in racial terms today, maybe, than we did in the past. I'm not saying that it wasn't, there wasn't a kind of a backdrop, but I often say to my students that when I did my O-level or A-level sociology in 1977, I think, we did like sort of 8 lessons on class and 1 lesson on race. Because that was how people understood their society. Whereas I think if you'd be doing it now, it would be a lot higher proportion, would be about race and ethnicity and self-identity. So we do live in more racialized times, which seems odd to say because plainly, the most important kind of slavery in history, which I think is the transatlantic slave trade and European enslavement of Africans in the 17th, 18th, early 19th century, was overwhelmingly a kind of a racially justified system. It was very much a black and white, and a lot of our modern day differences do arise out of that engagement. I mean, it's not a direct relationship necessarily, but it's definitely informed that kind of a thing. That said, I think, there's a lot of, because it is an emotional issue, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about slavery. So this is a common one. When I'm teaching, I say to the students, I mentioned in passing this happened, but of course slavery wasn't actually legal in Britain, and none of them believed me. They literally thought that those films that they saw, you know, like 10 Years a Slave and all that, they thought that that was describing a British situation. And I was saying, look, I'm trying to say that I'm not trying to excuse, I'm just saying that this was the case, was that slavery was a thing that was illegal in Britain and was legal in the colonies, you know. So it wasn't like British people weren't responsible, but they, because we you know, people sift their historical past mostly through like images and film and you know, stories. They genuinely believe that we had black slaves working plantations in Britain, and you know, I think this is an intriguing thing, the way that slavery and slavery reparations become more important to Black Britons the further we are away. You know, it used to be a common thing in you know, 1970s, 1980s Britain. I remember it well, that it was the reformists who believed in reparations and the revolutionaries who said we don't want anything to do with that. You know, Darcus Howe, C.L.R. James, Frantz Fanon, they all said, you know, reparations were a revolting idea, you know, because it would mean, to them, it meant that they it was an act of unfreedom, you know, to ask for help, to accept help from, you know, to beg for help from the people that had hurt you. Seemed to them contrary to the ideal of self-emancipation. Whereas,
Can I just jump in there? Sorry, I'm really taking this in, but with the idea of reparations, I know that keeps coming up and up and up, and it's been floated by David Lammy.
sure.
But the British Empire helped take slavery apart completely at great cost.
Oh, no. Let's go back. I mean,
reparations of a sort have already been paid.
Yeah,
Would that be a
I
fair?
think that's true, but you can't hear. You've got to listen to the you know, the argument against that. So a lot of people say, oh yeah. So this was Eric Williams' caricature of that argument. He said, oh yeah. They only enslaved us so they could liberate us, meaning it didn't. It's not entirely compelling, but it is true. I want to say, but I think you can rush to that point. You know, I think there are interesting arguments and analyses and investigations to be made, like how important was slavery to Britain's development. But yeah, the actual point is true, is that you know, Britain's policy changed. I think that's the easiest way to say it, is, you know, very early in the 19th century over the slave trade, and then a bit later over slavery per se. Britain went through a kind of massive self-critical moment where they, you know, looked at themselves and they said, well, this is wrong, you know, and that had many well springs. So it was, I say, like a lot of like black nationalists or black liberation people today will say, no, it was the slaves who emancipated the slaves, and that's not irrational. I want to say there's definitely a truth in that, which is that the Haiti Rebellion in 1805, and you know, the Baptist War, which was a kind of a black rebellious movement in Jamaica and in the West Indies. There are a lot of slave revolts, and those slave revolts certainly honed the mind of anti-slavery people. You know, Dr. Johnson famously raised his glass and said, "Death to the slave owners," and people were a bit shocked. But you know, the will of enslaved Africans in the West Indies not to be enslaved certainly was a component of the understanding. But the other major component, I think there are two. I mean, the other major component is moral. I think you know, you cannot understate the importance of what was called the Second Awakening in the United States and its impact on Britain. I mean, like the kind of Baptist movement, and its baptism changed its mind. The Baptist movement was somewhat divided, but eventually became, and Methodism became a kind of a wellspring of anti-slavery. And this is a very important component of British history, as well as Empire history. It's an aspect of it. And I think the other thing which I think people find awkward and a bit uncomfortable to talk about is the economics. So it is compelling that there are the Adam Smith and David Ricardo and a lot of the free market economists were very pointedly anti-slavery, but not in a. I mean, they were morally anti-slavery, but they were actually they were making an argument which was important, which was that slavery is inefficient, and this goes to a debate we're still having today about was it economically good, was it economically bad for Britain? And Smith's point, which, by the way, doesn't mean that he thought it was a good thing. On the contrary, he thought it was evil. But he was most compelled by the fact that if you compel a man to work, he won't work willingly. He says, but if you pay him to work, he's got an interest in working. So he very much believed in not. And people today read that wrong. They think, that it was just economic. Like it was just an economic interest. But for somebody like Adam Smith, economy and morality weren't separate things. It's a modern thing. We think, economic means venal, means corrupt. But to him, it meant like, no. In the same way that, morality is expressed in exchange, he meant to be free is not just good policy. It's right, but it is also good policy. So yeah, I mean, I think people today still having this argument. I do think it's it's not an open and shut case on either side. Was it good for Britain?
I think it hurt.
I mean,
morally it was bad, but economically it must have been good.
I mean, morally it's interesting because a lot of people that were engaged in the slave trade knew it was wrong. And that's quite hard because, and you kind of think, yes, they ought to have known it was wrong. But you're thinking, wow, they all did that stuff knowing it was wrong. So John Newton, who was a captain of a ship, involved in the slave trade, worked in the slave trade for more than a decade, and then had, and knowing it was evil, and then kind of couldn't bear it anymore and became an anti-slavery campaigner. And he wrote the song "Amazing Grace," which is it is meant to be people think it's like a Negro spiritual, which is understandable because it was very important. And that's because in its words, it contains an anti-slavery message, which he meant it. He wrote it as that. So, yeah, there's the big transitions. I think, in my lifetime, amazingly, it's surprising when anything happens in your lifetime, really. But in my lifetime, the judgment has completely flipped. So when I was at college, Eric Williams' book, Capitalism and Slavery, which is very good, I want to say, which makes this kind of really harsh argument, which is that capitalism is implicitly about slavery, and that slavery is fundamental to it. And he was the guy, and consequently there were a load of other scholars, because he was so effective. I mean, he was essentially a propagandist of the left internationally, and all the CIA guys were holding conferences and trying to knock the Williams thesis, and people like Roger Anstey and Seymour Drescher would write these scathing analyses of Williams' argument, tearing it apart. And that was conventional view, was that Williams was an outsider. And I always thought, you could write a paper called Eric Williams is Wrong Because ... because everybody had another reason why Eric Williams was wrong. But they just hated the fact that he was indicting capitalism by talking about slavery. That was the compelling part of it. But so that was the conventional view, was the one that was no, it was a bad idea and a stupid idea, and it was peripheral and unimportant. Slavery wasn't fundamental to capitalism; it was the opposite. But weirdly, since Williams has died, so very unfortunate for him, the Williams thesis become ubiquitous, and all historians certainly will say to you, oh yeah, it's fundamental that capitalism arises out of slavery. It's covered in blood, and I remember listening to a woman talking, who's an academic at Nottingham University, and she was saying, well, since they paid compensation for slavery, which we'll talk about in a bit, but that means that slavery is still here. And I'm thinking, well, that was a bit of a leap. And but so the idea is that I think the modern indictment, which actually is a misstatement of Williams' own position, is that fundamentally slavery is still with us. It's just disguised. It's changed its name, blah blah blah, something like that. And so all of the like the National Trust, who did a great report on slavery origins of the great houses and things like that, and everybody is like falling over themselves to talk about the terrible slavery paid for roots of British capitalism. So I like to say, well, look, it's yes and no, I think is the right answer. Is that yes, obviously in the 17th and a little bit in 18th century, I think, when British economy was a very different thing anyway, it did more trade. For example, the East India Company, Fort George, was bigger than Manchester in 1800. Meaning to say, we were like an international economy before we were a national economy, which always perplexed Adam Smith. And it was true that, we made our money by moving stuff from one place to another. That was the fundamental. So shipping was the real basis of the economic takeoff, the transition from being a royal landed barony type place into a mercantile successful place. So trading slaves was fundamental to that, and you could do this a good database network where you can see like who traded most slaves, and at the key moments it's Britain. Britain is the chief slave trader. Portugal is before us. If you do, people are very interested to make, because they're trying to score points. They say, well, take Islam over centuries, then probably more slaves were traded by Muslim slave traders, which might be true. But I just think it's of a slightly different order. The intensity and the volume of the transatlantic slave trade.
Just to jump in there,
yeah,
you said about Britain trading more slaves than anyone else at that time. I can't remember the title of it, but I read in a book somewhere about slavery that actually the British and the Europeans, they weren't like catching slaves with a net, sort of like child catchers, but it was African warlords were selling their captured slaves to the white men on the boats.
Very well.
Absolutely. Is that accurate?
Fair, correct point. You can read this very good biography of one of the slave traders. I think it's called Samuel. I can't remember, but anyway, it's published by Hearst Press, and it's really compelling about and there's a lot of great scholarship just on the. And if you go to West Africa, they'll take you around the pens and the dungeons that people were kept in. It's pretty horrific. And they were, to the I mean, there were like later Ashanti, and there were Gar and Dahomey, the people that sold the slaves, and they were the like dominant national groups in that part of what was called the Slave Coast then. By us, called the Slave Coast, and those people were warlike. You know, it was a lot of contested land, and they defeated a lot of Fante and different people, and so consequently, those people ended up being captives. And that when the Portuguese turned up, and they said, "Hang on, we want to sell you this stuff," and they said, "Well, we haven't got anything to exchange." And they said, "Well, you've got those guys over there." And they said, "Well, they're no good. I mean, they're just a nuisance hanging around the village. We were going to kill them." And they say, "Oh, well, we'll buy them." And there's a legend, I think it might be true, that, many of the Africans who sold slaves just thought they were going to be eaten. That was, because you can imagine, all they saw was them disappear over the horizon and never come back. Thought, well, these English people or these Portuguese people are off the chart. But anyway, the guy who ran the fort, the English guy that ran the fort for the Guinea Company, asked one of the African warlords who was selling the slaves. He said, "Well, how can you do that? How can you sell your own people into slavery?" And the guy looked at me and said, "What do you mean, my own people?" And what he meant was, to a Dahomey warlord, a Fante villager was as alien as the guy obviously replied, "Well, how can you put them in chains?" Meaning, don't be so moral. It was people don't know just how much the argument was had out. So all slave traders knew all the anti-slave traders' arguments inside out on all sides. But yes, plainly, they were captured. There were occasional, it did happen occasionally. But the thing that you said, I think it's called a wrestle or something like that. But mostly it was, overwhelmingly, they were sold into slavery by other Africans. So that was the thing. So my point would be, yes, obviously, I think slavery was important. It wasn't fundamental in the way that people say, because there were other aspects to Britain's overseas trade. It was a lot about trade to India. It was a lot about trade to Europe, a lot about wool, and all kinds of boring things that people, that don't kind of strike us so much today. But slavery is definitely a part. But I'd say it this way, and this would be my point about, which I think Eric Williams is better than the people that followed him, because he understood that, the modern economy couldn't really take off. And this is what people said at the time, because this was an archaic survival. It was a primitive way of doing business. It was degrading. It was morally degrading, but it was also not that successful. And you could see, because the slave plantations in the West Indies immediately were very successful. And this was a specific condition, which is the European and English populations were in the transition. They had been rural and they were becoming to be urban. And as they became urban, it broke off all their relationship to sugar. So there are a lot of natural sugars in the rural world, like in milk and honey and in fruit, which as a city dweller you don't have access to. And so that made the economy of sugar important, because it was hard work, it was hot, and it was relatively primitive social circumstances. They found it easier and cheaper to use slaves to grow cane sugar. Enslavement is a complicated thing. When you move somebody from one continent to another, what you do is you cut them off from all the networks of support. So it's a profound act of kind of isolation and oppression. But that was because of the primitive character of the plantation system. So immediately the plantation system was hugely successful. Like, they were really rich. They were the richest people in Britain. It was bizarre. It was the richest part of the empire. We did more trade with Jamaica than we did with, and the other West Indian colonies, than we did with the whole of North America. You know, that was more important to us financially because of sugar, because sugar was this kind of a key component of the early modern world. And then at a certain point, the world was awash with sugar. Everyone was making sugar. So the British plantations, having been the richest, but then became indebted and over mortgaged, and they'd given out too many shares to too many relatives, and the whole thing was massively indebted. So, which is key. So when the argument about compensation started this way, it didn't start with it as a anti-slavery campaign. It started amongst the slavery people, and they were saying they were goading the mostly Quaker critics, and they said, "Look, all you Quakers, with your mills up north," because they knew that was the truth. White slavery, it was called Yorkshire slavery. So, all you Quakers, why don't you buy the slaves? If you want them to be free, you can afford to. And they knew, because by this time, plantations hadn't been super rich in the 18th century. By the end of it, were massively indebted. So they said, you big mouths, buy us out. Buy us and release the slaves. And there was an actual pamphlet written to that effect, saying, if Quakers really want to, or if anti-slavery people really want slavery to be over, they could afford to buy us out. And then people worked it out, and they could. And that is what abolition is that fundamentally the British government borrowed £20 million, which was the estimated value of all the slaves, because, cruel to say that they were calculated to have an actual economic component. And, so they worked it out. And somewhere deep in the bowels of the Houses of Parliament is a big roll of vellum with all of the list of all of the names of all the people that got compensation. And 180 years later, the Nicholas Crofts and Catherine Hall wrote them all down and put them on a website. So now we can all laugh at the people that were implicated in the slave trade, like Benedict Cumberbatch and George Orwell and David Cameron and all of that. So because they all gave their names up asking for the compensation. So the compensation was a deal. People often say, "Oh my good grief, how can this is monstrous that the British paid money to slave owners. They didn't compensate the slaves, but they compensated the slave owners." But I say to them, if you had been a member of the British Parliament in 1833, you would have voted to compensate the slave owners, and you would have had to, because that would have been the moral thing to do. There wasn't, there wasn't a majority for abolition without compensation. That was what it cost to get it across the line. And I think anybody who would have said at that point that you would say, no, it's more important that we keep our hands clean and don't pay these horrible slave owners than that we release the slaves. I'd say that person was a monster. I think, of course, it's morally compromised solution because, we were in a transition period between one view and another. And I think there was a kind of a taboo against expropriation anyway, which is a kind of business attitude, which I understand. Nobody likes the idea of expropriation. They probably thought, well, if they expropriate slave owners, maybe they'll expropriate Yorkshire mill owners too. So that was the compromise. And like I say, I think you'd have had to have voted for it. And of course, none of the money ended up in the West Indies because they were so indebted. The money just it went into the bank account and then promptly disappeared off into whoever lent the money, which generally meant industrial concerns in Britain, or banks in Britain that lent money to industrial concerns in Britain. So it was the payout, the £20 million compensation, was a payout that essentially allowed British industry to be reconfigured from being somewhat of a slave owning into much more of an industrial. And that's the kind of a transition. I think that's important to see how that thing worked, to understand it. But in terms of the morality of it, you say, but nobody compensated the slaves. I don't think that's true. They did indeed compensate them. They bought them their freedom. And if you go to Jamaica or Barbados and you go uphill to the towns that the former slaves made, you'll see they're called Sturge Town. Meaning to say they're named after, or Brown Town, and they're named after famous anti-slavery campaigners at the time. Later, black nationalists would say, oh, I hate the fact that we have to make obeisance to the memory of Wilberforce, as if he freed us, which was a burning thing.
I was born in Hull. I've been round his house several times growing up. I did a lot of reading on him when I was a kid. I wrote a piece on my Substack earlier this year about William Wilberforce helping to free the slaves.
He was a very funny guy. There's a great story about, I can't remember the guy's name, it's a very naughty guy, playwright, and who was louche and terrible person. And he knew that Wilberforce was a prig and, uptight and everything. And he was out drunk and with some prostitute. So his trousers are falling around his ankles, and the policemen turn up, and she runs off, and he's sprawling drunk on the floor. And the police say, "What's your name?" And he goes, "William Wilberforce." Which was a great gag at the time. Anyway, Wilberforce is a fascinating character. And very much exactly, all the Chartists and the early Labour historians, they secretly hated the anti-slavery people. And this has often confused people because they were livid that the anti-slavery campaign absorbed all of the goodwill. And they said, these hypocrites, we hate them, because all the same people who, making us work like 15-hour day and all the rest, are the people, our owners want to abolish slavery in the West Indies because industrialists generally did. And they would say, caustically, they would say, Chartists like William Lovett and that people, they say, of course they want to abolish slavery in the West Indies because they don't own slaves in the West Indies. Let them abolish slavery in Yorkshire. Now, if you say that to an audience today and you say Yorkshire slavery, they say, get lost, get out of here.
And I was just thinking that myself.
And I understand it. So if you were imagine being like a black student in a British classroom being told by your lecturer that, Yorkshire slavery, you say you're taking the mickey. So people often make the point, which is true, by the way, that the Irish were slaves. And it's true. When Cromwell cleared the lots of Ireland, they packed people off and they sent them as indentured servants, to be cautious, but they were effectively slaves. And so the people that first worked the plantations in Jamaica, they were white, they were Irish. And Irish right-wingers today will say, we were slaves, and slavery reparations campaigns will say, oh, shut up, that's grotesque. And but both are true.
It's funny about the reparations thing. Some people have made jokes about it, and some people have seriously said, well, if Britain's got to pay reparations to the descendants of black slavery, I want reparations from Germany, the Viking descendants. Like, where does it end? Because it's just going to go on forever, isn't it? Every culture on this planet, dark part of human history, is on slaves at some point. You can't pay reparations for it.
Yeah, I think really, if you did reparations, it would be effectively to undo all of history. I mean, people have different views of history, but I mean, most of it is like a kind of endless succession of cruelty and stupidity. And the best bits are the bits where we try and correct that. But Hegel made this point years ago. He said, evil is more of a motor of history than good, meaning that selfish, aggressive people tend to make things happen, and and people that are a little bit callous, whereas people with big hearts, they're important, but they're better at clearing up the mess made by the chaos. So evil is and if you undid it all, I mean, I think there is this would be an argument. So there were reparations paid at the end of the Second World War. And it was an important part of Germany's reinvention. So if you were Germany at the end of the Second World War, you've got a big hill to climb in terms of making yourself an acceptable part of the human race again, because of the record of fascism. And they did do it by compensation. So they did indeed pay a lot of compensation to Israel. Palestine is protesting about this right now because obviously some of that compensation bought guns and things like that, but I think that was it. It was a reasonable intent, and I think there was a kind of politicized compensation reparations issue. So I think American governments in particular used it to kind of strong arm European governments. So the whole thing about Swiss gold, I think that was kind of worked up. I mean, the Swiss banking industry is foundational claim is that it's blind to what you do with the money. But that did seem to make them complicit. But I think the whole Swiss gold reparations issue was one that was kind of political or diplomatically created. So I mean, I think they're all kind of difficult. All reparations issues have a kind of confusion in them, and I think fundamentally that you can't. It's impossible really to make a reparation, because it would really mean undoing history. It would mean, and also I think this is quite. People don't really get this. This was why I was really interested that a lot of radical black activists used to be really against it, because fundamentally the act of reparation secures the moral authority of the repairing party. So it's never really about black empowerment. It's always about, in fact, I think it's literally degrading in a sense. It's morally degrading to put yourself in the position of asking for reparations, because you're asking the injuring party to make you good, to make things whole, to make them good. So I think that I think there is something kind of degraded about the CARICOM, the West Indian countries coming together and once again presenting Britain with a bill. And in these arguments, I've often made the point, well, they have actually made reparations. If you wanted to make the case for reparations, I mean, there should be better scholars for a start, because Lord Palmerston said we definitely owe reparations to Africa for the slave trade. He said in Parliament, that's so you can make the legal case very interestingly, very straightforwardly. And then the next sentence was, and this is why we are financing the West Africa squadron of ships in the Royal Navy, which they did for 60 years. It cost millions of pounds. It cost hundreds of seamen's lives. It was an extensive operation, policing operation, extraordinary, really. It was given that it was a period of peace, it was foundational to the British Navy. That for a long period, from about 1840 through to about 1860, this was, apart from the Crimean War, it was the thing that the British Navy was most involved in. And they created this system. It's not just like a military system, but it was a diplomatic system. So in collaboration, you know, they put into every treaty that they signed with every other country, they put in a clause saying, you know, we will help Britain police against the slave trade. We're going to help them suppress the slave trade, and they created mixed courts in Cuba and Brazil and in the West Indies and in West Africa, and these had British judges and French judges sitting on them, and they pressed other countries like America and France to support these things, and it was a massive instrument of suppression of the slave trade, which Britain financed, and that was so that's the first kind of act of reparation. There are other acts of reparation, but if I go through them, you'll think this isn't really reparation. But people don't understand that this is actually what happened historically. So when there's a number of conferences in Europe that were conducted from about 1878 through to 1883 in Belgium and in Brussels and in Berlin. In these different conferences, they divided Africa amongst them. That's what we know historically, is that the European powers divided Africa amongst them. What people don't often notice is that what they thought they were doing, what they believed they were doing, is they were suppressing the slave trade. So often we can see it. It's often presented in paintings and films and things like that, where there's a massive banner, where all the delegates are looking, and on the banner is a great map of Africa, and they're pointing, and you imagine they're selecting their favourite bit. They're going to divide Africa up. But nobody ever looks like what was the name of the conference. It was an anti-slavery conference. And the map, which was created by the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, Anti-Slavery International today, was a map of trade routes. And so their motivation, their actual self-declared intent, was that they were going to suppress the slave trade, which by then was principally an African slave trade, mostly Muslim slave traders. In East and West Africa, but mostly in East Africa, East and Central Africa. And that was the morally motivating issue of the time. So nobody, of course, will be satisfied with this, because what the outcome is that they colonized most of Africa, or they planned the colonization of Africa to suppress the slave trade. That was the actual intent. People will say, and they're right, when you look back, you think, actually, maybe that wasn't the best thing to do. You look at what King Leopold, who broke lots of these things, what he got up to in Belgium, or what the British did in Egypt and different places. You'd say, maybe it would have been better not to have done that. But they genuinely believed that they were helping him. And then in 1945, again, there's a massive welfare payments, which again was presented as reparation. And like I say, none of these acts of reparation, I think, would satisfy any modern-day black protester over reparations. They would all say, but look, each one of those acts of reparation didn't make black people's lives better. They made the British Navy stronger, and they made the British Empire stronger, or, they compensated. And I think that's the problem, is that fundamentally that's what reparations do. Because reparations, basically, they're always on terms of the repairing party. They're all about so your idea of what is a resolution to this problem has got to be agreed with the more powerful party, the one that's making reparations, and their ideas of what's good will always inform the outcome. So if you don't like that Europeans decided to make reparation for the act of slavery by colonizing Africa, you're right, but that's the trouble with reparations. It's always about restoring the authority and the power and the status of the repairing party.
Okay, so my final question that I want to put to you, I know you've given me nearly an hour of your time, and I really appreciate it. It's been really fascinating listening. Um, why is there such a focus on like slavery seems to be in vogue at the moment? It seems to be talked about day in day out. It feels like, and it's always white Europeans owning black Africans for as the stereotype. Why is nobody up in arms about the sub-Saharan African slave trade that's still going on today in 2025? It's still happening, yet no one's up in arms about it. They're selling women and children.
Well, I think this is a cultural thing. You know, we're in a weird moment where, uh, uh, you know, European advance over 500 years has been pretty strong, but I think was kind of knocked off his pedestal by American success in the 20th century, and then more recently, developing countries like China and Brazil, and you can feel that the center of gravity of the world has moved, and I think there's and that so that sense that we're not the architects of the world anymore also is mixed up with a lot of guilty self-reflection. I think European culture is in a very strange place because the sense in which we feel bad about our past is so compelling, and sure, there's a lot of wicked in it, but there's a lot of good in it too. I think there's John Newton and a Joseph Sturgeon in it, as well as a slave trader, as well as Charles II sending his brother out to restart the Royal African Company. But so all those things are there and available to us. But I think it's about us. It's about our self-identity, and a lot of this is to do with the way that mainstream ideologies have all broken. So we used to have like two good, strong stories about the way forward, and one was like the free market, free society, which is a good story, and I want to say it's got a big component of the truth in it. And then we had the other, the kind of underdog, kind of socialist planning, and all of that. But both of those ideologies are like kind of on the rocks, and what you get in that situation is like a general kind of self-loathing, self-critical attitude, which only ever emphasizes the bad. And I think it's quite strange the way people relate to their history. To me, history's fun. It's interesting. They're all interesting characters, even the bad ones. You're interested.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's an element of personal identification, but you also kind of know that it's not true. In its nature, history's no longer there. It's what happened. If it's there, it's not history. So I don't really understand why people feel bad about history. It's like, well, you can't fix it. It's the one thing you can literally not change is what happened in the past. Anything in the future, you can have an influence on that, but you can't change the past. It's there. So I do think it's crazy. And I also think it's mad that people are surprised that people in the past were, had some horrible sides, because you think, well, we would be, if we think we're okay, we think we're good people, roughly. So obviously we're a bit better than them. Do you know what I mean? It's like, if you want to believe, I think it's great, women got the vote and they got representation. I think, racism became unacceptable. I think these are all great steps forward. But, those steps forward couldn't have happened if there weren't problems in the past. When we talk about, what we like about ourselves, we should understand, because obviously, but we've gained by those people. They've made all that possible, in some ways by being so bad that we had to do something good. But I think it's a shame that, so what to me seems like a story of advance, But I think contemporary historians view that as a terrible ideology. You know, they call it like the Whig view of history, that there is cumulative advance, and instead they see it all as myth, and you know, it's and so they spend their time undoing the myths. And I always think, well, you know, you spend so much time undoing the myths, you deconstruct everything, and or you just end up as if a kind of very depressed and kind of hateful and self-loathing picture. You know, to me, history is about, you know, there is good and there is bad. You know, there are questions put in front of us. They're not the same questions, but we can learn something a bit by looking at what people did in the past. We can understand where our institutions came from. But I did the kind of self-critical, self-loathing thing, I think, is insane. And you know, over slavery, I'm with you. I think putting that into the past, that was a great thing. You know, there were all weird stuff that went on in the middle of that. But whatever the processes were, I honour the, you know, the black Africans who fought against slavery in Africa, in Britain, and I think that's really important. But I honour the moral, upright, slightly priggish and weird, but actually fantastic people who changed our minds over that. I think they were great people, as did the anti-colonialists like Fenner Brockway and you know, people who campaigned against you know, that we, you know, imperialism had its day. These are great people, and they're often weird and eccentric in their own ways. But you know, I think all these stories are part of it, and I love the, you know, the you know, people like Nelson, and you know, people don't. They have a very weird idea of you know, just what was going on with all of that, and you know, how much the British Navy was involved in suppressing slavery. You know, and often it was on the oppressive side, but often it was on the liberatory side. And you know, like my plea to everybody would be, you know, don't just dwell on the bad stuff. You know, try and see the heroism and the productivity and the greatness and the wit and the charm of people in the past as well.
And I think that's a fantastic place to end it. James Heartfield, thank you ever so much for your time.
Hey, no, thank you. And it's great talking. I'm glad we got it together.
No, we'll do it again soon. Thank you ever so much.
Definitely.